plot lines that's often in movies or books is something called the chosen one trope. And you're probably familiar with this scenario. There's a person, usually a young man or a young woman, and they have somehow been called into destiny. They have been prescribed to save their people. They are the chosen one. They are maybe an inevitable hero, a reluctant hero perhaps, but they have been divinely ordained or set aside for the purpose of being a hero. So you've probably seen or heard some movies that have this chosen one trope. I think of Lord of the Rings. And in Lord of the Rings, Frodo, the humble hobbit, was the chosen one, the one who would be the bearer of the ring of power, and he alone was able to carry it into the land of Mordor and throw it into the fires of Mordor in order to destroy the ring. Frodo was the chosen one. Or in the Harry Potter books and series, Harry Potter is the chosen one. He was, kind of prophesied to be the one who would destroy the Dark Lord Voldemort. And Dark Lord Voldemort had killed his parents when he was a child. So now Harry Potter was the one that would grow up and kill Darth Voldemort. Sorry, I'm not really familiar with Harry Potter. But I am familiar with Star Wars, another chosen one story where you have Luke Skywalker. And he was the one that would be the last Jedi, the one who would bring balance to the Force, the one who would bring balance between the light side and the dark side. Luke Skywalker was going to be the one to correct the wrongs of his father, Darth Vader. And here in Genesis, we have another chosen one trope. God promised to send Abraham and Sarah a chosen son. This chosen son would be the recipients of God's blessings and God's promises. And through Abraham's chosen son, Abraham would have as many descendants as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. The only problem was that Abraham and Sarah were childless. They were old, they were barren, and when God first came to Abraham, they had no son. Throughout the years, there are many false starts or false hopes of who might be their chosen one son. So at first, Abraham thought the chosen one might be his nephew, Lot. He had raised Lot. He had kind of taken Lot under his wing. But pretty early on in the story, Lot and Abraham go their own separate ways. Lot is not the chosen one. Second, then Abraham believed that his lifelong faithful servant, Eliezer, would be his chosen one, would be his heir. But God said no. Eliezer would not be the chosen one. The chosen one would be Abraham's own son. Well, at this point, Abraham and Sarah, they start to get a little impatient and take matters into their own hands. So Abraham has a son with his servant, Hagar. They name him Ishmael. So surely this is Abraham's son. This is going to be the one who is chosen to receive God's promises. But once again, God said no. The chosen one would be you and Sarah's own son. And eventually, after decades of waiting, Sarah was 91, Abraham was close to 100. They finally have their chosen one son, Isaac. So imagine Abraham's surprise one day when God comes to him and said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt sacrifice." Abraham would think, surely I didn't hear that right. Kill Isaac, kill the chosen one son, kill the son of promise, the one that has been born in his parents' old age. Doesn't God know that's not how the story's supposed to go? Doesn't God know that Isaac is the chosen one? This isn't supposed to be how Abraham's story ends. We don't know how Abraham responded, but that's what brings us so many questions in this text. Like the other stories we've been studying in this series, Bible Stories for Grown-Ups, this story is pretty troubling. Again, it's not rated for kids. It's probably PG-14 or even maybe rated R. This story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, it really unsettles me. It leaves me with a lot more questions than answers. What kind of God would ask this of their father, would demand the sacrifice of a beloved child? What kind of father, Abraham, would just go along with it? What do we do with a story like this? And in fact, as I was preparing for this sermon, I discovered that is actually the lectionary passage for this week. So in other churches around the country, around the world, they too are reading this Hebrew Bible passage of Genesis chapter, what chapter are we in? Well, Genesis chapter 22. And as I was looking through the different commentaries and lectionary sources that I usually go to when I was preparing my sermon, one commentary literally said this about this passage. What do we say about this story in Genesis? The inclination is just to skip over it. There is too much to unpack, too much to face, too much trauma to unleash, and maybe it's best to just skip it. That was their recommendation for this story, like super helpful. Let's just skip over this story. It raises too many questions. And really, in our own lives, that's what we tend to do with stories like this one. We just kind of skip over it or pretend it's not in the Bible. You see, this story, it reads more like a horror story than a Bible story. When Isaac turns and asks his father, "Father, where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" We're all screaming at the page, "It's you, Isaac! Get out of there! Run as fast as you can!" We are confused about Abraham's role in all of this. He doesn't really seem to talk back to God, to question it. I think about how just a few chapters earlier in Genesis 18, Abraham had pled with God on behalf of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, had begged God not to destroy them. And yet here, he's not willing to plead for the life of his own beloved son, Isaac. So as we put on our grown-up lenses of curiosity and serious engagement, I wonder how we can read this story in a new way. How can we interpret such a story as this? One way that we have often tried to make sense of this story is to understand this passage as God's testing of Abraham. And it's true, right there in the very first verse, it says that God tested Abraham. Maybe God wanted Abraham to prove his loyalty and obedience to him. Perhaps God just wanted to see how faithful Abraham really was. Would Abraham really go along with something as outlandish as killing his own son? And while this idea of God testing someone may seem far-fetched, we must remember that in Abraham and Isaac's time, this was a time when people worshiped many different gods, many different idols and goddesses. Each tribe had their own God that they believed in and followed. And even Abraham hadn't always followed our God, Yahweh. He came from a land that worshiped many idols, and God called him out of that land and said, "Come and follow me and go to the place that I will show you." And unfortunately, a lot of these gods and goddesses that other people worshiped, they weren't always so nice, and they demanded a lot of sacrifices. So people would offer sacrifices to appease these gods. They would offer sacrifices to increase their harvest. They would offer sacrifices to send the rains or to give them children, to prevent some sort of calamity. And as they did this, the gods were in a way asking the people to prove their obedience to them, to prove their loyalty to them. And if it was a particularly dire situation, something really important that needed to happen, the people might even offer a human sacrifice as an attempt to get their gods' attention. I'm sure that the kids here today are glad that we don't practice child sacrifice today, but we must remember that Abraham and Isaac lived during a time when this request wouldn't be all that outlandish. So in trying to sort out this story, we might also take the perspective that God never really intended for Abraham to kill Isaac. It was always just a test. And after all, that's how the author of Hebrews interprets this story. As we read earlier, by faith, Abraham offered Isaac when he was tested. And the verse goes on to say that Abraham was so confident in God that he believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead if necessary. Abraham believed that God performed miracles. After all, God was the one who gave him Isaac in his old age, so surely he could raise Isaac back to life. We might think that if this was just a test, perhaps Abraham passed the test. But I have to admit that this interpretation that God was just testing Abraham, it still troubles me. It doesn't sit well with me. I mean, does God really go around testing people like that? Is that the kind of God we want to follow? It kind of makes God seem like this cruel puppet master, kind of pulling on the strings and seeing if we're going to go along with these elaborate schemes. If God is testing us, then does that make God any different than those other tribal gods and goddesses who demanded people to prove their loyalty to them? However, many times we use this very same interpretation in our own lives. When we're going through a difficult time, when tragedy strikes, we might think, well, God is just testing me. When we go through a painful illness, when we lose someone we love, when there's a tragic accident, we might even hear other people say, well, God is just testing you. I'm not sure that I agree with that. Pastor Adam Hamilton writes in his book, Half-Truths, I don't believe God gives his children cancer. I don't believe God causes people to commit murder. I don't believe it's God's will for someone to die in a car crash. But even in all of these terrible occurrences, God has a way of forcing good to come from tragedy when we trust God with it. God doesn't use these difficult situations to test us, but rather God uses these painful circumstances and situations to show God's faithfulness to us, to show us how he is with us in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the calamity and the evil. In the middle of our difficult situations, God sees us and God provides for us. And that, I think, is the point of the story of Abraham. Not that God is going around testing us, but that God faithfully provides for us, just as he did for Abraham and Isaac. See, this story paints a very different picture of God for someone like Abraham, who was used to all these tribal gods and goddesses of the ancient time. Unlike these other false gods of Abraham's day, our God doesn't actually require us to make costly sacrifices. Our God is not someone who needs to be feared, someone who needs to be appeased, someone who is demanding and cruel and vengeful. Rather, this story shows us a picture of a God who is faithful, a God who provides for us and provides for our needs, not the other way around. Because God ultimately doesn't demand anything from Abraham, but provides him the ram for the sacrifice instead. God is saying to Abraham, I don't actually require this sacrifice from you. I don't need you to prove your faithfulness and loyalty and love and obedience to me. Rather, I'm going to prove my faithfulness to you. I will provide you with another way to worship. I, myself, will provide the sacrifice. And so at the end of the story, just like we saw, God provided a wild ram for Abraham to sacrifice in Isaac's place. And Isaac goes on to name that mountain Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord sees or the Lord provides. Now, I wonder for us today, how can this story give us a new understanding of God? How might this story paint a new picture of God for us? How can we open ourselves up to see God in new ways? Does this story help us believe that God actually does see us? That God actually does care for us? How can we embrace this vision of God not as a demanding God that needs to be appeased, but as a God who is faithful, as a God who comes through in the end and provides for us? And for us as Christians, we read this story through a New Testament lens. And we see a powerful foreshadowing of what was yet to come, because Isaac was the precursor to Jesus. In fact, many churches, we read this story on Good Friday, that day when we reflect on Jesus' own sacrifice and crucifixion. We hear the story of Abraham's almost sacrifice of Isaac. But yet the difference is that God did not even withhold his firstborn son, but allowed Jesus to be sacrificed on the cross. We remember that God understands the pain of losing a firstborn, beloved son. We remember that God provided his own son for the sacrifice to redeem us, to forgive us from our sins. Romans 8, 31 and 32 says, if God is for us, then who is against us? He didn't spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. Won't he also freely give us all things with him? Just as Abraham believed that God had the power to raise Isaac from the dead, we believe that God did use this power to raise his own son, Jesus, from the dead. So as we read this story of Abraham and Isaac through new lenses, through grown-up lenses, this story ultimately gives us a picture of God the Father who provides, a picture of God's goodness and faithfulness, a story that reminds us that God ultimately intervenes for us, just as he did for Abraham and Isaac, that God ultimately delivers us from these desperate and dire circumstances, a God who raises us to new life again, as he did his own son. This story tells us that God provides, that God is faithful, and that God sees us no matter what we are going through. And we remember that God provides for us each time we come to the communion table, as we will do here in just a few moments.